Hi, I'm Jane Muller from Growcom, Queensland's Fruit and Vegetable Growers Industry Association. This webinar is part of Growcom's Whatever the Weather program. This is a natural disaster preparedness initiative for Queensland's horticulture industry. Our initiative is supported by funds from the Australian Government's business program under their Department of Industry and Science. In this webinar series, we're looking at a framework that growers can apply in their business to help move to a more proactive approach to managing the risks of severe weather events and natural disasters. It's a simple framework that helps growers think through the things they can do on the farm and in their business to prevent impacts from natural disasters, or at least hopefully reduce them, to prepare for severe weather events, to be able to respond effectively if something occurs, and to be in the best possible position to recover from damaging weather events. The framework is commonly called the Prevent, Prepare, Respond, Recover framework, and it's used by emergency agencies around Australia and in fact around the world, and we think it's just as useful to be used in the fruit and vegetable industry. In previous webinars, we've had a look at reconsidering the climate risks that your farm might be exposed to. We've looked at what options you might have to prevent or at least reduce disaster impacts. And we've looked at the preparations that you could put in place well in advance of any kind of severe weather that would be helpful to manage unavoidable risks or impacts from natural disasters. In this webinar, we're going to be looking at the response step in the PPRR framework. So here, we just need to imagine that your farm is in the path of a cyclone, a really destructive storm, or some kind of flood. What you can do to respond obviously depends on how much warning you get and how much time there is before there's likely to be an impact. The respond step in our PPRR process is about ensuring that you make the best use of whatever time you have. Are you ready to respond quickly and effectively? Do you know what needs to be done to ensure that your family and your staff will be safe, so that animals on the property can be protected if at all possible? Do you know what needs to be done to reduce the potential impacts to avoid as much damage as possible to your crops, to your farm, to the pack shed and to your farm office? Do you and your team know what to do in the hours and days immediately after a natural disaster event? When we think about disaster response, we automatically tend to think about the preparations that you might be doing on the farm. And I think most growers intuitively know the sorts of things that they would need to do around the property prior to a weather event approaching. In this webinar though, we'll look at those things that need to be done, that sort of outside work that needs to be done, but we'll also talk about some of the things that you might want to be doing in terms of administration tasks in the farm office that can be useful if you've got the time to do them. If you have prepared a written emergency plan, that's going to be invaluable to you now to guide your team's response in the face of a bad weather event or a flood situation. So first up, we're going to talk through some of the response tips for prior to a severe weather event occurring on your property. So the first thing, of course, is the people issues. If you've got a little bit of time before a severe weather event hits you or a flood event hits you, that's the time to sit down with your team and review your emergency plans, your evacuation plans, any sort of safety arrangements that you have with your family and with your staff. If there's time, you might want to be checking on your neighbours if you're worried about them. You also need to be able to prepare to evacuate if necessary, or to talk about what's the trigger point to evacuate if that's likely to be needed. So having a think about what's got to happen around the farm. Most growers, as I mentioned, will have some pretty clear procedures or some experience from past events from managing things like this. So the sorts of things that people might be thinking about doing is shutting off electricity if that seems like a good idea, moving equipment or vehicles or pumps if that seems like a good idea, looking at your fuel, chemical or fertiliser stores, looking at whether they need to be secured or anything needs to be done there. Similarly with your farm buildings and sheds, is there anything that needs to be done to secure or to check those? Obviously you need to get around the property and secure any loose items, that's an obvious one. A lot of growers now have put a lot of thought into what they would do with their crop or with their orchard if there was heavy rain or heavy wind on its way. A lot of people have got de-leafing strategies or know what they would do in terms of really pruning down their trees hard. So obviously you'd need to have good agronomic advice about how you approach that. People might even consider whether they can get in there and get an early harvest on crop that can be harvested early. You might want to be trimming vegetation or windbreaks. You might want to be thinking about getting ready to switch to an alternative power supply, and if you've got time to think about how you're going to manage livestock or pets. What we don't always think about doing is things that can happen in the farm office around your farm administration. Have a think about if you've got any deliveries or any orders, whether they should or could be cancelled or delayed. You might want to think about getting in touch with your customers or your supply chain partners, perhaps let them know that it's possible you could have some disruptions to your normal supply. This is an opportunity, if you've got the time, to make any final backups of essential data or records and get them organised onto the cloud if that's what you're doing, onto USB memory sticks, portable hard drives, that sort of thing. Make sure your mobile phones and your tablets, your laptops are all fully charged, that you've got you know where the chargers are, and you've got spare batteries or power banks if you're using them. This is an opportunity to just quickly check in on your business emergency kit and your contacts list, get all of that stuff packed into a waterproof container if it looks like it's going to be a flood event or there's some sort of severe weather that could that it could be something that's getting some wind or water damage into the farm office. The next point to think about is your communications. Obviously people would know to be tuned into radio to get whatever updates or alerts or warnings are available. Increasingly people are tapping into social media. The Queensland Police certainly use Twitter and Facebook quite a lot. Regional councils might be doing the same thing. And other organisations like the Queensland Government or the Red Cross could also be using social media, and they can be quite useful avenues for getting really up-to-the-minute information. So now we're going to have a look at the things that might be important to know about immediately after a severe weather event has occurred. So obviously the first point is around safety. You need to have a really good check around for safety hazards around your home, around the property and around the farm buildings. You need to check that everyone on site is okay. Obvious one, stay away from fallen power lines. I think we all know that one. If it seems like a good idea, it might be, and you haven't done so before, it might be time to turn off any gas or electricity or even water at the mains. If you've had water damage or some kind of damage that's occurred to your electrical gear, you're probably going to need to get a properly qualified person or licensed tradesman to come in and inspect those things, to reconnect them, and perhaps do some testing and provide some safety certificates for them. So after a severe weather event or a disaster event, communications is obviously really important, but often sometimes quite fraught and difficult. If you can, again, you need to be staying tuned to radio. If you've still got internet access, social media, again, can be really valuable for up-to-date information, continuing alerts or warnings. You might want to have your emergency contacts list handy for ready reference. If you do have internet access, a lot of growers have found that things like Facebook are a really, really handy and efficient way to just keep family, friends, possibly business partners informed of what's going on the farm. And I guess the other point to recognise is that if it's been a severe weather event or a full-scale natural disaster, you may not have electricity, you may not have phone lines, mobile phone services or internet connections. And that could be for hours, it could be for days, in some cases it can be for weeks. It's really good for people to have thought through what their kind of alternate communication options might be if that's going to be the case. Okay, so let's have a look at what's going on around the farm post-event. When it's safe to get starting to move around the property, you can get out there. This is a time when you might start to record whatever damage has happened using cameras your iPhone. So getting plenty of photographs and maybe even video footage is a really, really good idea. This is the time when you might be getting out there and assessing what's happened in your crop or in your orchard, what damage has been done, what crop's been lost, trying to make an early assessment on what produce might be recoverable. You'd start at this stage to be able to do some sort of a preliminary damage, loss or impact assessment. Growcom provides a kind of a standard spreadsheet that growers can use to record and start to make that sort of impact assessment. That's available on our website. And the other thing to keep in mind when you do that sort of initial impact assessment is that it's really going to be a preliminary assessment, and to get a really true picture of the loss and the damage that might have happened may take weeks or possibly even months. As you start to build up a picture of what sort of damage might have been done around your property, it's a good idea to actually start to share that impact information with your industry organisation. If you've got crop that you're wanting to, if you've got crop that's been harvested and it's ready to market, you're obviously going to, or even if it's just about moving around the region, it's good to know where you can access information about road closures and road conditions. So there's some useful help numbers for that, and also some websites. Again, if you've got access to your telecommunications and information systems. So these numbers for the Transport Department and for these road conditions numbers are a really good thing to have in your mobile phone or handy on a tablet or a laptop, so that you can access them really easily if you need them. So the next issue is around your farm team. For you to check in with your staff, just check how they've come through the event, whether they're on the property or somewhere else. Something that a lot of industry recovery officers and people who've been involved with disaster recovery have talked about is that if people have experienced sort of trauma or shock from being involved in a natural disaster event, getting involved with some purposeful work is actually, for some people, is a really good way to help them cope and to sort of get through it. So if your staff are able to get to the workplace, and if they're fit and if they want to work or they want to help you out, it's actually a really good idea to give them some work to do. When a natural disaster event has occurred in a horticultural production region, what Growcom does is we mobilise our staff to basically get on the phones and start calling growers in areas that have been affected, to check in with people, to start to talk with people about what's happened out there. It's a way for us to start to scope the damage and to start making an early assessment of whether those regions are likely to need some form of government assistance. When we get on the phone with growers, if we can get through to people, we try to get them in touch with the help that's immediately available if that's what's needed. Growcom plays a really important role following natural disaster events in terms of that initial impact and damage assessment. We collaborate really closely with regional councils, with the Queensland Farmers Federation and other industry organisations, with the Department of Agriculture, to start to pull together the information that we need to build a case for industry assistance through the natural disaster relief and recovery arrangements that are shared between the state and federal governments. Growcom's often been in a really good position to start to pull that information together, and it's sometimes meant that our industry and growers in Queensland have had access to support and assistance that hasn't been made available to growers who have had similar impacts in other regions or other states. Again, if you do have access to the internet, we try to update our websites and our Facebook pages and those sorts of things as quickly as we can with really up-to-date disaster recovery and assistance information. So if you want some more information, jump on the Growcom website. There's plenty of information sheets on there, as well as some checklists and templates and other useful stuff. Thanks for joining us today, and I hope you'll join me for the final webinar in our PPRR series, where we're going to be looking at what's good to know if you're a farm business recovering from a natural disaster event.